All right, welcome back. Happy Thursday, y'all. So under today, again, you have another Socrative. Remember, you're only going to be able to get into this if you log in during your class time. I have to manually make this go live, and as soon as class starts, like following the bell schedule we normally follow, is when that becomes active. I'm going to try clicking on it again to see if that works. If not, go to Socrative.com. It's spelled exactly like that right here. But this link doesn't seem to be working. But either, oh, there we go. The room name always going to be the same as I said last time. This will probably be the last time I go over how to log in, and if you forget, you can just come back to one of these videos. Join. If I seem to do that, it keeps seeming to keep taking me back to the room name. So instead, go to Socrative.com. Remember, go to login, student login. The room name is Weaver 8556. And then remember your name, you put your last name first and then your first name just because it's super easy. Any day there's a Socrative, this is going to be what I use to take attendance, and most days we will have Socratives. So if for some reason you don't get to finish the last assignment or the second assignment or whatever else is in Schoology by the end of the bell, that's okay, and you can finish that for homework. But this Socrative is going to be, when it's there, what I use for attendance. So make sure you're logging in when class starts to take this, and I'll check it at the end of class when I close it and make sure that you're on there so I can take attendance for everybody. So we talked about the Renaissance in our last video, and the great thing about it being videotaped is you can go back and rewatch it as many times as you wanted. Today, we're going to still talk about the Renaissance, but today it's going to be on something a bit different called secularism. So today, our objective, just like last time, and hopefully you're starting to get used to this a little bit, today's objective looks super similar to the one that we did last time. We're still talking about the same topic. The last time it was to use that comparison scale, which means to compare and contrast both similarities and differences. Last time it was the Middle Ages and Renaissance. But now, in our entire last lecture, we talked about the Italian Renaissance because that's where it began due to its geographic location, the wealthy merchants, the amount of people buying art, and so forth. Today's going to be a little bit different. Today, we're going to compare that Italian Renaissance and how it spreads north to German areas and northward, and how the Northern Renaissance is going to be similar to, but also different than the Italian Renaissance. So again, the scale, the last time I had you put it at the end of your Machiavelli sheet. You're going to also turn in a worksheet today at the end that I'll show you in a minute. After the last question, I'd also like you to put what number you are down after going through this work and listening to this lecture. And if you could put just like a sentence explanation of why you put down that number, that would be great, just to give me a little input of where my students really need the help. So like I said, don't put a 3 just because, oh, well, I need Mr. Weaver to think I know all this 3. Be honest with yourself and really think, explain to me where you are and why you think so. So now we're going to talk about secularism. Secularism, I barely touched on in the last lecture, and it was about how it's removing religion from government and other things. The Italian Renaissance is going to be increasingly secular, but not completely. You have to remember that religion used to rule everything in the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance isn't going to get rid of religion. It's not. The Italian Renaissance is still religious, but it's starting to become more secular. It's starting to separate God from everything and starting to, I don't know if you can hear that, but they're smashing the dumpster next door. I don't secularism, it's removing God from everyday life and basically saying that other things are important as well. Uh, so by the 16th century, the church is already corrupt. Some things that they're doing, they're selling indulgences, which is basically paying a fee in order to. You're good, Mr. Neubauer. You can come in. This is just wonderful recording. They just heard the dump truck, and now you can wave in the background if you want. You want to say hi to Mr. Neubauer? Want to wave? There you go. So in the 16th century, the church is already corrupt. They're selling indulgences, which are basically, if you sin, you can pay the church money, and they'll give you a little slip of paper that says your sins are forgiven. They're allowing people to buy different positions within the church. That's something called simony, which we'll talk about later on. But the church has its problems, and Machiavelli is going to see that. So at this point in European history, people began to question the legitimacy of the church and its power over governments. Remember that skepticism vocab word we talked about in the last lecture, what it means to question what you thought you knew? One particular that agreed with the message of Erasmus, who we'll talk about in a little bit, and Machiavelli, was a man named Jean Bodin. So he is from Italy still. So we're still focused on Italy. So basically, he's another one of these humanists. When they have to deal with how government should run, we call them civic humanists. So still a type of humanist, but when you put the word civic in front of it, it means they have a special interest in how the study of humanism influences the government. So he was basically believed that the church was super corrupt and in particular should not be involved in European politics. He thought secularism, the government and religion should be separate. Now, this is a completely radical idea because for so long, the religion has had power over kings and nobles and basically power over everyone that lived underneath them. So instead, Bodin is going to advocate for strong, centralized governments that control their own taxes and politics with no church involvement. Now, you got to remember the church is not going to like this. The church collects a lot of taxes and is very powerful and rich due to having control over these governments. So they're not going to like these ideas that say the church doesn't need to be involved anymore. So you'll notice as these ideas that we keep talking about the next 100 years, the church is going to resist a lot of these new ideas because traditionally they are the ones in charge. So if you hear anybody talk about traditional power, it's the church. And slowly but surely, we're over the course of time, we're going to watch the church lose its power because of people like this who started to question its role and the people started to agree with. So Bodin is someone we call a civic humanist. This is civic humanism right here. So the question of the church and corrupt power and emphasis on secular political life without the church spawned a new movement, as we just said, called civic humanism. Still coming from the classics, it's still studying those ancient Greek and Roman texts, and that it should be a broad humanities education we're learning. Intellectuals or thinkers advocated that not only should people seek a well-rounded education, but they should also get involved in the community rather than be just an educated hermit or someone like you might read a lot of books, but if you don't use that knowledge for anything, what is that knowledge really doing? So civic humanism is going to take humanism a step further and say not only should you study these things, but in addition you should use that knowledge out in your community to help. So basically writing about what you think is wrong with the world. Another thinker, writer, humanist by the name of Leonardo Bruni is going to advocate that you need to be proactive. This means going and voting if you're able to, and many people at this time couldn't. But remember, as we said, the Renaissance isn't for really normal, poor peasant, the majority of people. This is for the upper class living in cities who would have the right to vote. And it depends on which Italian city-state you live in, but that's not super important. Participating in politics, discussing issues and reforms. They say the two things that you should never discuss is politics and religion. Well, in this class, the two main things that we're going to discuss, especially in period one, are, wait for it, religion and politics. So because of humanism, Bruni, who was also the first to use that word humanism, and others emphasized the focus on secular life and politics, as well as being involved in shaping the world that you live in. So it takes humanism, which is the study of all those different ideas being well-rounded, and secularism, separating the church from everyday life and the government. And these two are going to be the civic humanists that agree with that and start to push that idea. And it's important to remember the church is always going to push back against these ideas because if you're taking power away from the church, you're taking away their money, you're taking away their power, and the church is going to fight as hard as they can to keep that throughout history. Castiglione is an author of the Book of the Courtier. It's basically like a handbook guide for nobility to how to act. I don't know if anybody watched this, but on Nickelodeon there used to be the show called Ned's Classified like School Survival. It was like a middle school guide how to get through middle school. Kind of think like that, except this is for high class elite nobles type thing on basically how they should act. And you can see right during this the main part, the High Renaissance. It's basically going to emphasize that a Renaissance man should be well read in the classics, the Greek and Romans that we're talking about, a gentleman, a warrior if needed, a poet, musician, have wonderful manners, and a good moral character doing the right thing. So instead, you can see how this differs from the Middle Ages, only being educated in one thing, your job and religion. He also discusses women in this. Now, women, we're going to talk about women a little later on. Now, when we talk about the Renaissance, for the most part, women actually lose some of the rights they had in the Middle Ages, where the work was equal. But women in the Book of the Courtier, he believed that women should be educated enough to engage in conversation, be witty, be comical. No one wants to talk to someone that's dull and boring. So be educated. Um, but more importantly, as Castiglione says in the Courtier, he calls them attractive ornaments for their husbands that should remain completely feminine. Not doing manly things like wrestling, playing music, or playing tennis. Now, obviously, playing music or playing tennis, like in wrestling, are unisex, can be done by both male and female. But I don't know if playing music or playing tennis we consider today, like when you think of something like manly. Like I played the trumpet myself, but it's interesting to see how those things have kind of changed over time. So again, this is just one man's opinion on how it should be. This book is going to become popular because of the printing press, and basically this is going to create that proper society of these nobles. But again, remember, this really wouldn't have much influence on the average person. um, Leon Alberti, this is a picture that he painted himself. He's just, this is one of the, I don't want to say lesser important names that you need to know. You need to recognize this name as an Italian Renaissance humanist, and just realize that he is one of these Renaissance men. He basically is kind of good at everything. You can see a self portrait he painted of himself here. He's a humanist, he's a writer, an architect, a mathematician. Had the quote, "Men can do all things if they will." And we bring him up, even though he's not, Petrarch, Machiavelli, Castiglione, and the people that we've mentioned are more important than this guy. But he just is like the epitome of a Renaissance man, and it's important that you can recognize that with his name if you see it. Same for this guy. This isn't super important, but again, recognizing the name, it's really easy with the I at the end. This is a politician that wrote the history of Italy. So using, think about it, one of those humanities, history and literature, where he's going to describe an accurate depiction, at least in his eyes, what he sees happening in Italy. It shows the importance of what's going on Earth, writing it down, keeping track of these things, serving the Medicis, Charles V, who we'll talk about more later, especially during the Protestant Reformation, and other powerful people. And the reason we bring him up is it illustrates like an accurate, logical evaluation of the politics of Italy. God really doesn't have anything to do with it. Religion doesn't play a major role in his writings, and it's just another example of how people are focused on everyday real life rather than only religion now. All of these people that you just see all the way up even to before, they are still Christians. They still belong to the Catholic Church. Many of them are loyal Catholics. You just have to remember they started questioning what the church's role should be, over government and everyday life and things of that nature. So slavery during the Renaissance. This one I just said Florentine Academy, and Platonism. Basically, it's just a school that was opened by one of the Medicis, uh, that's going to patronize, which means to basically pay for this group of humanists to get together and discuss the works of Plato, and read the classics and discuss them. And it's really not super important, but you might see the name come up. It's just important to remember that now people are openly discussing these old ideas, and a lot of humanists would gather to do so. But again, not super important, but definitely recognize the name and what the purpose of them getting together was to discuss the classics, especially the work of Plato from ancient Greece. So slavery in the Renaissance. So we talk about this rebirth, new way of doing things, but slavery still has a very active role in Italy at this time. So Spain is really going to be responsible for a lot of the slave trade. They're obviously not the only ones, but they're going to sell a lot of Muslim slaves captured in wars and raids to wealthy Italian merchants. And it's been going on for hundreds of years, even before the Renaissance. Slavery during this time, as crazy as it might seem to us, was seen as a merciful act by a lot of people, because otherwise those people that were captured would have just been killed. By having them serve as slaves became seen as a merciful act, and obviously we know any type of forced labor or servitude isn't merciful, but that's just a way that it was seen during the time period. Obviously, not everyone, even from that time period, would agree with that. The Black Death created a need for laborers. Remember, we talked about how laborers started demanding more money because there was less of them. So if slaves became even more popular afterwards because people were needed to work the fields very cheaply. Sometimes they were accepted as family members, but no matter what, were legal property of the owner. Uh, some slaves were treated better than others. It really seems that in Italy and the rest of Europe, the more European you were seen, the better you were treated as a slave. As you can see, all the different groups of people that were treated as slaves, and then people with darker skin from Africa tend to be treated worse off because they were seen as different. So, what ended the Italian Renaissance? All right, so this slide, you shouldn't write down more than like 2 sentences because this is a whole lot of information. So, put your pen down for a second and just kind of listen, and I'm going to try to make the most sense of this that I can. So Italian city-states had treaties with each other against other city-states in times of conflict. Sometimes they would all band together to defeat a non-Italian opponent like France or Spain or the Ottomans or something like that. So no, Italy is not one country. It's divided up into a bunch of different city-states. Sometimes they're fighting against each other. Sometimes they're allies, whatever helps them out in that particular war conflict. You don't need to know the conflicts of these at this time. So in 1494, two Italian city-states are going to threaten each other. And when Naples threatens Milan, Milan is going to invite France to come into Italy and basically say, hey, ally with us, and you can have the territory of Naples, which they used to own up until 1442. So France agrees. They march in. They take control of Florence, the Papal States, which is who the Pope sees over, and Naples. So they work their way into Italy. And remember, all these other people wanted control of Italy because of their geographic location, and you could make a lot of money off trade. So then Italian city-states all unite against France to kick them out in 1498. So France comes in, takes over, gets defeated, taken out. So later on, the next king of France, after I believe it was Francis the First, I might be wrong. I'm sorry, Charles the Eighth. After Charles the Eighth dies, Louis the Seventh or the 12th takes over and invades the papal allies with the Papal States to invade Milan in 1499. So you can see it wasn't that long later. Here comes France again. The next pope that took over didn't like that France was there, created an alliance with Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Maximilian I at the time. Again, remember, the Holy Roman Empire was not holy. It wasn't really an empire, and it sure wasn't Roman. The Swiss and other people to drive the French out. Again, you don't need to worry too much about keeping track of this, but I think it's interesting. But wait, here comes France again. Francis the First of France is going to, who takes over after Louis XII, is going to come back in, make the Pope sign. Basically, this just means like a proclamation or a law or an agreement, which gave the French king control over the clergy in his country, but recognized the Pope's superiority over any Catholic rules. Basically, it's just an agreement between France and the Pope that, okay, France, you can have the powers to create your own clergy. I'll stay out of it the best I can, but you still acknowledge that I'm the one in charge of the Catholic Church. So it was kind of like a handshake. France, you get this little token, and the Pope gets this token of being in charge. But now Spain is angry at France being in Italy again, so now it becomes time to fight more wars. All of these conflicts are summed up in something called the Italian Wars, or the Habsburg-Valois War, which is just the name of the two families fighting. The Habsburgs being from Spain and Austria, and the Valois being French. So really, like, the progression, please don't write all of that stuff down. Maybe the agreement here is good to know because it keeps French Catholic for a long time and is agreement between the two. But really, you just need to know that the Italian Wars are going to destroy Italy. So look at this, during the main time of the Renaissance, right around the time of the High Renaissance, these wars are going to be fought. Spain and France are going to use it as their battlegrounds, allying with different city-states, and it gets super confusing and not needed to know, but just understand in general what's going on. So, Mr. Weaver, what does this long, confusing story have to do with the Italian Renaissance? These constant wars are going to destroy Italy and kill many of the people living there. Many people say the Italian Renaissance ends in 1527 with the sack of Rome. So the sack of Rome is just pillaging, killing, robbery of Rome by Holy Roman Emperor Troop Charles V, who was a Habsburg, so Spain. The Papal States and other Italian city-states were trying to kick out Spanish influence after Spain defeated France. Charles V didn't order his soldiers to do this, but remember, we said the Holy Roman Emperor wasn't really an emperor. He had to pay an army to fight from regions all around. When he was late paying his soldiers and they were overworked from years of fighting, they mutinied and basically just pillaged Rome, killing a lot of the people inside, taking the spoils of war for themselves. So when Rome was sacked by Charles V's troops, who was Holy Roman Emperor, again, he didn't order them to, they kind of mutinied on him. This brought about the end of the Renaissance because a lot of things were stolen, destroyed, burned down, people killed, and so forth. So just know that all of this constant fighting is what ends up bringing an end to the Italian Renaissance. And know that the reason Machiavelli wrote The Prince was because he was living in Italy during these times. He saw all these weak, ineffective rulers getting pushed over by bigger nations and wanted to stop to it, which is why he said Italy needed a strong ruler by any means necessary to take power and stop these constant wars in Italy. Okay, so that sums up the Italian Renaissance, but due to the printing press and trade, these ideas are also going to spread northern up into German areas, England, and up that way. So it's my hope that you'll be able to, like I said, the comparison skill, we already looked at that earlier. So Northern humanism is also known as Christian humanism because even though there were still Catholics in Italy, Northern humanism is going to be and the Christian Northern humanism is going to be much more focused on religion, while Italy was becoming much more secular. So Christian humanism. It's a movement that developed in Northern Europe during the Renaissance, combining the classical learning, being well-rounded, the ancient study of, Greek and Rome, with the goal of reforming the Catholic Church. So while the Italian Renaissance didn't get rid of the church, it started to exclude it or secularize it from the government and everyday life. Christian humanism is going to go another way, and instead of separating it, trying to reform the church. In addition to a focus on secular political life, the Renaissance also impacted religious life in Northern Europe. So Christian humanism. Mostly in Northern Europe, thinkers began reading classical Christian texts such as the Bible and St. Augustine's writings. During the Middle Ages, Christianity had become highly dependent on the Pope, all these different religious rituals, traditions, and relics. But as people started to read the Bible, because remember the printing press, there's more Bibles available. Things are starting to be written in the vernacular or people's language that was spoken, so more people were able to read. They started seeing that all of these different traditions and rules of the Catholic Church aren't in the Bible. And the Bible, to a lot of people, was supposed to be God's word. So why is the Catholic Church adding things that aren't in the Bible? So instead of focus on pleasing the church, the Pope, and its traditions, these Northern humanist thinkers are going to focus on having an individual spiritual life in your own personal relationship with God. Basically saying you don't need the Catholic Church in order to have a relationship with God. Again, Catholic Church not going to like that. Less people paying money, less power. So church reform calls. These are two really important people and two really important books that you need to know. So two Christian or Northern humanists that are going to show this movement are Erasmus, who writes Praise of Folly, and Thomas More, who writes Utopia. Both of these men agree that Christianity should serve as a guiding moral philosophy, not as like the set thing of rules and traditions that the Catholic Church set up. Both men are going to write about how corrupt the Catholic Church is, especially the sale of salvation. Remember, those are called indulgences. You could pay for yourself to be forgiven of sins, or if you had a family member die, you could pay money to forgive their sins to get them out of purgatory and go up into heaven. You could buy church positions, and a lot of times it wasn't given to and other times it wasn't given to the most qualified person, but also just family members, friends, people you wanted to make happy because the church positions were very comfy positions. These thinkers began to question the Catholic Church and its power, claiming the church had drifted away the true intentions and beliefs of Christianity. So these people consider themselves good Catholics and good Christians. They are not trying to break away from the Catholic Church. They are not trying to go away from the Catholic Church at all. They are just saying the Catholic Church needs to be reformed to go back to reflecting the Bible and the true intentions and beliefs of Christianity. So this is when you're going to go to Schoology, somewhere here, the Northern Humanist and Christian Humanism sheet. You are going to go and you're going to basically read some of the writings, a couple paragraphs worth of both Erasmus Praise of Folly and Thomas More's Utopia, and answer the questions that go along with them. Remember that we had the objective 1, 2, or 3, and you can find that in the power. I was going to say, if I go back up here, this is what you're keeping in mind. Able to explain the similarities or differences between the Northern and Italian Renaissance. So as you go here and read the sheets and fill out the question, remember we talked about what the purpose means. Remember we talked about what the audience means in the last video. And then at the bottom, after you answer these, I'd like you to put 1, 2, or 3 and a brief sentence as to why you feel like you are that number based on the objective. And the last couple of slides we're going to talk about today is women in the Renaissance. So basically, if you haven't noticed, all the people we've talked about have been men. The Renaissance much more impacted high elite men than it did women. As you could remember in Castiglione's book of the Courtier, women were meant to be educated, witty, but really just an attractive ornament for their husbands, which is an incredibly sexist idea. But let's talk about women of the Renaissance a little bit. Women of the Renaissance, like women of the Middle Ages, were denied all political rights and considered legally subject to their husbands. Women of all classes were expected to perform first and foremost the duties of being a housewife. Peasant women worked the fields alongside their husbands and ran the home. The wives of more middle class, like merchants and people like that made a little bit better living than farming with the peasants, often helped run their husband's business and needed to be knowledgeable in that in case anything happened to the husband and just to help him as well. Even women of the highest class, attended by servants, also helped engage in those household tasks, sewing, cooking, entertaining, among others. Women who did not marry were not usually permitted to live alone. Instead, they joined the households of their male relatives or joined a coven, basically, the church. Remember, the church played a major role. So again, these are generalities. Not every single, this doesn't apply to all women, but in general, just like how we looked at slavery during the Renaissance, this is in general how it worked. Now, there are a couple women that are going to break that mold. Isabel Batiste is going to be one of them. She is going to rule an Italian city-state by herself. She's going to influence art. She's going to collect many paintings and musical instruments and so forth. So she's a woman that's going to have a lot of political power in an Italian city-state. So if a question was, for a short answer question, to basically come up with a woman that, did experience success in whatever during the Renaissance, this could be one of your examples. I wouldn't worry about writing all of this stuff down, but instead just kind of bullet point a couple of the major things about her on the slide that we talked about. Christine de Pisan is another one. She was a privileged, educated noble who promoted new education, humanism, and culture at royal courts. She's going to be an author. And remember, according to, I believe, another line of Castiglione's book of the Courtier was women should art and literature but never create it themselves. So Christine de Pisan here would be going against Castiglione. She's going to write a book called City of Ladies, which is basically a story that shows the accomplishments of women throughout history. She was married at the age of 15, as many people married younger back then, usually arranged marriages, especially for nobles. Her husband died when she was 25, and she continued to write poetry and books to support herself. So even though, these ideas and humanism applies mostly to like wealthy male elites, you can see that's not the case in all opinions. You have a woman that was able to write a very popular book about the great accomplishments of women, known as the first feminist, wrote poetry, not just for fun, but made money off it to support herself. So even though we talk about these general things, this is how it was for most people. Remember, there's always going to be exceptions to that, and it's good to know one or two exceptions of that in case you're asked about it on the exam. These key concepts at the end that you'll see, I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but you should. I don't write them down. This is basically just all of the things that we went over. So you should kind of read through and be like, yep, I'm good with that. I'm good with that. Oh, I'm not so good with this. I should go back and re-listen to this part or reach out and ask me a question. For example, Italian Renaissance humanists, including Petrarch, promoted a revival in classical literature. Some Renaissance humanists further the values of secularism and individualism. Hopefully, you can come up with the ones that did each one. Hopefully, you know the printing press allowed the spread of new ideas and so forth. So this is be a nice page for you to look over. Again, attendance today will be taken on that Socrative that I had you do at the start, and then make sure you get this Erasmus sheet turned in too. And then that will be everything for today. I hope this was helpful. I look forward to hearing from you with any questions. Good luck.